My name is Juliette. I stood in the back row of a highly exclusive, invite-only auction house in the heart of Manhattan, holding a pristine crystal wine glass that was entirely empty. The room was filled with the quiet, murmuring hum of extreme wealth. Men in bespoke, tailored suits and women dripping in understated jewelry sat in velvet chairs, holding bidding paddles, waiting for the main event of the evening to begin. Down at the front of the room, standing near the polished mahogany auction podium, was my stepfather, Richard. He was wearing a rented, ill-fitting tuxedo that stretched tightly across his midsection. He was sweating profusely, shifting his weight from foot to foot, his face split into a wide, greedy, practically feverish grin. He was looking at a massive, temperature-controlled display case sitting next to the auctioneer. Inside that case was my late father's entire vintage wine collection. Richard was standing there because he believed that in approximately 20 minutes, he was going to walk out of that building with a certified cashier's check for $500,000. He thought he had executed the ultimate theft. He thought he had outsmarted me, stolen my inheritance, and secured the funding for his pathetic midlife crisis. The lead appraiser of the auction house, a man with a highly refined palate and a severe expression, stepped up to the podium to authenticate the crown jewel of the collection before the bidding opened. It was a dusty, meticulously preserved bottle of 1945 Chateau Mouton Rothschild, widely considered one of the greatest vintages of the 20th century. A single bottle easily commanded $20,000 at auction. The room fell completely silent as the appraiser carefully cut the foil capsule and inserted a specialized Osso cork puller into the neck of the bottle. With a practiced, elegant twist, he extracted the cork. He poured exactly 1 ounce of the dark red liquid into a tasting glass. He held it up to the light, checking the color. Then he brought the rim of the glass to his nose, closed his eyes, and took a deep, analytical inhalation. I watched from the back of the room as the appraiser's eyes snapped open. His severe expression dissolved into a look of absolute physical revulsion. His face violently recoiled from the glass, his mouth twisting into a grimace as he actively gagged. He didn't need to taste it. He didn't even need to swirl it. Within seconds, the harsh, unmistakable, eye-watering stench of pure acetic acid drifted across the front rows of the auction house. It wasn't a $20,000 vintage Bordeaux. It was Vinegar. Richard's $500,000 stolen collection was completely, irreversibly ruined. And I was the only person in the room who knew exactly why. To understand how my stepfather managed to turn a fortune into salad dressing, you have to understand the science of wine and you have to understand my profession. I am a Master Sommelier. It is not a title you earn by simply taking a weekend course or reading a few books about grapes. The Court of Master Sommeliers is one of the most exclusive, grueling, and psychologically demanding professional organizations on the planet. There are fewer than 300 people in the entire world who hold the title. To pass the final examination, you must possess an encyclopedic knowledge of global viticulture, geography, soil composition, and history. You must demonstrate flawless, elegant service mechanics. But the most terrifying aspect of the exam is the blind tasting. You are placed in a silent room with 3 master examiners. They place 6 glasses of completely unmarked wine in front of you. 3 white, 3 red. You have exactly 25 minutes to verbally identify the dominant grape variety, the specific region of the world it was grown in, the sub-appellation, and the exact vintage year, using nothing but your nose and your palate. To achieve that level of sensory precision, you have to understand wine at a molecular level. Wine is not just fermented grape juice. It is a living, breathing, incredibly fragile chemical organism. It relies on a perfect microscopic balance of ethanol, tannins, acids, and esters. As a bottle ages over decades, those compounds slowly bind together, softening the harsh tannins and creating complex secondary and tertiary aromas of leather, tobacco, truffle, and dried fruit. But because it is alive, it is also highly susceptible to death. A vintage wine requires an absolute, uncompromising environment to survive its decades-long slumber. A proper cellar must be maintained at a constant, unwavering 55 degrees Fahrenheit, with a relative humidity holding perfectly at 70%. If you expose a vintage wine to excessive heat, even for just a few days, the results are catastrophic. As the liquid inside the bottle warms, it expands. It pushes forcefully against the bottom of the cork. If the heat persists, the cork is pushed upward, breaking the airtight seal. Once that seal is compromised, oxygen floods into the bottle. And when oxygen meets ethanol in the presence of naturally occurring Acetobacter bacteria, a violent chemical reaction occurs. The bacteria consume the alcohol and excrete acetic acid. In the industry, we call it materization, or being cooked. In layman's terms, the wine literally turns into vinegar. It cannot be reversed. It cannot be fixed. The wine is dead. My late father understood this science perfectly. My father was a brilliant, gentle man, a successful architect, with a profound, lifelong passion for oenology. He was the one who taught me how to taste. When I was a little girl, he would let me smell the corks from the bottles he opened for Sunday dinners, teaching me to identify the subtle notes of blackcurrant, cedar, and wet slate. He nurtured my palate and funded my early sommelier education. Over the course of 30 years, he built a masterpiece beneath our family estate. It was a custom, subterranean wine cellar, lined with imported French oak racking and fortified by a massive, commercial-grade HVAC climate control unit that ran independently from the rest of the house. Inside that cellar were 2,000 bottles of the finest wines ever produced. He had verticals of first-growth Bordeaux, Chateau Lafite, Latour, Margaux. He had Grand Cru Burgundies from Domaine de la Romanée-Conti. He had rare vintage champagne resting quietly in the dark. It was a collection built on passion, not just wealth. He knew the story behind every single label. And he always told me that one day, the cellar would be mine. It was my spiritual inheritance. Tragically, my father died of a sudden, massive heart attack when I was 27 years old. The grief devastated me. But worse than the emotional devastation was the legal nightmare that followed. My father had been healthy and relatively young, so he hadn't updated his will in over 15 years. Because of that oversight, the entirety of his estate, the house, the bank accounts, and the $500,000 wine cellar, passed directly to his surviving spouse, my mother. My mother, Eleanor, is a deeply insecure, passive woman who is terrified of being alone. She has never made a major decision in her life without a man telling her what to do. 14 months after my father's funeral, while I was still deeply mourning his loss, she married Richard. Richard was a nightmare, walking on two legs. He was a middle management accountant who had never achieved anything significant in his own life. So he derived his power from dominating others. He moved into my father's house and immediately began acting like a tyrant. He hated anything that reminded him of the man who built the estate. Richard was arrogant, incredibly petty, and obsessed with control. He drank cheap, mass-produced domestic beer out of aluminum cans and constantly mocked my career. He would tell his friends at barbecues that I was just a glorified waitress who poured overpriced grape juice for rich snobs. I ignored his insults, retreating to the cellar whenever I visited, seeking comfort among the bottles my father had so carefully collected. But Richard's most defining characteristic was his obsession with money. Specifically, he was obsessed with cutting costs on the estate to fund his own selfish desires. He constantly complained about the utility bills. He would walk around the house, turning off lights, adjusting the thermostat so the house was sweltering in the summer, and screaming at my mother if she bought brand-name groceries instead of the generic store brand. Meanwhile, he was secretly browsing online catalogs, for luxury speedboats he couldn't afford. The theft occurred shortly after my 30th birthday. I had gone over to the house on a Sunday afternoon to check on the cellar. I was preparing for a major blind tasting exam and wanted to select a specific bottle of 1990 Chateau Neuf du Pape to practice my Rhone varietal identification. When I walked down the basement stairs and approached the heavy, solid oak door of the cellar, I stopped dead in my tracks. The brass lock, the one my father had installed 30 years ago, was gone. It had been drilled out and replaced with a heavy, industrial-grade deadbolt. Panic flared in my chest. I ran upstairs and found Richard sitting in my father's leather armchair, watching a golf tournament on television, drinking one of his cheap beers. "Richard, why is the lock changed on the wine cellar?" I demanded, my voice shaking with anger. Richard didn't even look at me. He took a slow sip of his beer, his eyes glued to the television screen. "I changed it on Thursday. I had a locksmith come out." "Why?" I asked, stepping in front of the television to force him to look at me. "That is my father's cellar. I need to get in there." Richard finally looked at me, a smug, cruel smile spreading across his face. "It's not your father's cellar anymore, Juliette. Your father is dead, and it's certainly not your cellar. It belongs to your mother, which means, legally, it belongs to me." "You don't even drink wine," I shouted. "You don't know the first thing about it." "I know how much it's worth," Richard countered, his smile widening into a greedy sneer. He reached into the side table drawer and pulled out a dusty, leather-bound binder. It was my father's meticulous appraisal ledger. I found this in his old desk. I spent a few hours looking up the current auction values online. "Do you know there's $500,000 sitting in that basement?" I felt the blood drain from my face. "Richard, you can't touch that wine. That collection was his life's work. It was supposed to be left to me." "Well, it wasn't," Richard stated flatly. "And I'm tired of paying the massive electric bill to keep that stupid basement freezing cold, just so you can play sommelier on the weekends. I'm liquidating the entire collection. I've already contacted an auction house in the city. With $500,000, I can finally buy that 50-foot Sea Ray I've been looking at." "You're going to sell my father's legacy to buy a boat?" I asked, my voice dropping to a horrified whisper. "I'm selling my property to buy whatever I want," he corrected me. I looked frantically toward the kitchen, where my mother was wiping down the countertops. "Mom, are you hearing this? Are you going to let him do this to Dad's memory?" My mother didn't look at me. She kept wiping the counter, her shoulders hunched, completely submissive. "Juliette, please don't start a fight. It's Richard's house now. We need to respect his decisions. Just let it go." I turned back to Richard. The sheer, overwhelming rage I felt in that moment was indescribable. But I forced myself to take a deep breath. I forced myself to think like a professional. "Fine," I said, my voice eerily calm. "If it's about the money, I will buy it from you. I will empty my savings. I will take out a personal loan, and I will pay you the appraised value for the collection. Just give me a week to get the financing together." Richard looked at me, his eyes narrowing. He hated me. He hated my independence, my career, and my connection to my father. He didn't just want the money. He wanted to hurt me. He wanted to assert his dominance. "No," Richard said, taking another sip of his beer. "I don't want your money. I want it out of my house. The auction house is sending a transport truck at the end of the month. Don't come back down here demanding access again, Juliette, or I'll have you cited for trespassing." I walked out of the house that day feeling entirely broken. I had lost my father, and now I was losing the only physical connection I had left to his passion. I thought Richard had won. I thought he was going to successfully steal my inheritance, humiliate me, and sail off into the sunset on a luxury boat funded by my father's life work. But I didn't know that Richard's own arrogance and his obsessive, petty need to save a few pennies was about to trigger the most spectacular, financially devastating self-destruction I had ever witnessed. Have you ever had a step-parent or a new partner enter your family and immediately try to erase the legacy of the biological parent? Did they do it out of greed or purely out of insecurity and a need for control? How did you handle the disrespect? Tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one. July arrived with a brutal, suffocating intensity. A massive, slow-moving, high-pressure system settled over the region, plunging the area into a severe 2-week heat wave. The daytime temperatures consistently peaked at over 105 degrees, and the nighttime temperatures rarely dropped below 85. The air was thick, stagnant, and completely devoid of moisture. It was the kind of heat that made the asphalt on the driveway soft and caused the massive oak trees in the yard to visibly droop. For a normal household, a heat wave like this meant keeping the windows closed, drawing the blinds, and running the central air conditioning to maintain a comfortable, safe temperature. But my mother's house was not a normal household. It was ruled by Richard. And to Richard, the heat wave wasn't a physical discomfort. It was a personal financial attack. As the temperatures climbed, Richard's obsession with cutting costs escalated into pure, unadulterated mania. He viewed the spinning digital numbers on the electric meter outside the house as a direct threat to his bank account. He began stalking through the hallways, turning off every single light. He screamed at my mother for running the dishwasher during peak daylight hours. He unplugged the microwave and the toaster when they weren't in use, claiming they were drawing phantom power. He locked the central thermostat at a miserable 80 degrees, forcing my mother to sit in the living room with a damp washcloth on her neck just to endure the afternoon heat. But Richard's penny-pinching paranoia eventually found a much larger target. On the third day of the heat wave, Richard went down to the basement to check the electrical panel. He noticed the massive, dedicated 220-volt breaker that powered the commercial-grade HVAC climate control unit for the wine cellar. Because the ambient temperature of the house and the surrounding earth had risen so dramatically, the cellar's compressor was running continuously, 24 hours a day, fighting a desperate battle against the laws of thermodynamics to maintain the strict, uncompromising 55-degree environment required by the wine. To Richard, this was an unacceptable waste of money. He probably did the math on a piece of scrap paper. He probably calculated that the heavy-duty compressor was costing him roughly $20 a day in electricity. Over the course of the 2-week heat wave, that would equate to nearly $300. $300 that, in his mind, should have been going toward his new luxury speedboat. Richard didn't know anything about wine. He didn't know anything about chemistry or thermodynamics or the fragile nature of a living organism trapped in a glass bottle. He operated on the simple, arrogant assumption of an uneducated man. It's a basement. Basements are naturally cold. The machine is just a luxury. He reached out, grabbed the heavy black switch on the electrical panel, and flipped the breaker. With a loud clunk, the commercial HVAC unit shut down. The low, constant hum that had resonated through the basement for 30 years went completely silent. Richard probably smiled to himself, proud of his own fiscal brilliance, and walked back upstairs to drink a cheap, lukewarm beer. He didn't realize that by flipping that switch to save $300, he had just initiated the violent, irreversible destruction of $500,000. Inside the heavy oak door of the cellar, the catastrophe began almost immediately. Without the massive flow of chilled, humidified air, the temperature inside the subterranean room began to rise. The concrete walls, superheated by the surrounding earth, began to radiate heat inward. By day 2, the temperature inside the cellar reached 70 degrees. The relative humidity plummeted from a perfect 70% down to a bone-dry 30%. This is where the physical destruction of the collection commenced. Wine corks are made of natural, porous tree bark. They require constant, high humidity to remain swollen and tight against the glass neck of the bottle, creating an impenetrable, airtight seal. But as the humidity in the cellar vanished into the dry, stagnant air, the corks began to shrink. They dried out. They became brittle. By day 4, the temperature inside the cellar hit 85 degrees. As the liquid wine inside the bottles heated up, it expanded. The expanding liquid pushed forcefully upward against the drying, shrinking corks. Hundreds of microscopic seals were compromised simultaneously. Some corks were pushed entirely out of the neck, hitting the wooden racks above them. Other bottles began to weep, pushing sticky, dark red trails of vintage Bordeaux down the sides of the glass labels. The airtight sanctuary was broken. Oxygen, the ultimate enemy of aged wine, flooded into the bottles. And with the oxygen came the microscopic assassins. Acetobacter. Acetobacter is a naturally occurring genus of acetic acid bacteria. In a properly chilled cellar, they remain dormant, completely inactive. But when introduced to an abundance of oxygen and superheated to 85 degrees, they wake up and they begin to feed aggressively. Over the course of the next 10 days, a microscopic slaughter took place in the dark. The bacteria consumed the complex ethanol, the alcohol that gave the wine its structure and life, and metabolized it. They excreted raw acetic acid. The delicate, decades-old notes of black cherry, aged leather, and truffle were violently erased. The 1982 Chateau Lafite Rothschild, a wine celebrated by critics as one of the most elegant creations of the 20th century, was reduced to a cloudy, foul-smelling liquid. The Grand Cru Burgundies, which my father had purchased on a trip to France before I was born, were systematically, chemically dismantled. 2,000 bottles, $500,000, 30 years of passionate curation. All of it turned into sour, volatile vinegar, simply because a petty, arrogant man wanted to save $20 a day on his electric bill. I discovered his crime entirely by accident. On the 12th day of the heat wave, I stopped by the estate. My mother had asked me to pick up a package that had been mistakenly delivered there instead of my apartment in the city. Richard was at work, leaving my mother alone in the sweltering 80-degree house. After retrieving my package from the kitchen, an overwhelming sense of nostalgia pulled me toward the basement door. I missed my father. I missed the smell of the old oak racks. I knew Richard had changed the lock and that I couldn't get inside, but I just wanted to stand near the door for a moment. I walked down the wooden stairs into the darkness of the basement. Something was immediately, profoundly wrong. For my entire life, standing in that basement meant listening to the steady, powerful hum of the commercial compressor. It was the heartbeat of the house. But today, the basement was completely, terrifyingly silent. I walked quickly toward the heavy oak door. I placed my palm flat against the thick wood. It was warm. A cold spike of pure adrenaline shot through my veins. I leaned forward and looked through the small, grated iron windows set into the top of the door. The interior of the cellar was dark, but I could clearly see the digital environmental monitor mounted on the far wall. The numbers glowed a harsh, aggressive red. Temperature, 88.4 Fahrenheit. Humidity, 28%. I stumbled back from the door as if I had been physically struck. I couldn't breathe. The air in my lungs felt like broken glass. I looked down at the floor near the threshold of the door. There was a thin, sticky, dark red puddle seeping under the wood, pooling onto the concrete. Several of the bottles inside had completely blown their corks from the extreme heat expansion. The wine was dead. My father's legacy, the beautiful, living collection he had spent a lifetime building, had been murdered. My first instinct was violent. I wanted to run upstairs, grab a hammer, smash the deadbolt, and try to salvage whatever was left. I wanted to scream at my mother for letting this happen. I wanted to wait for Richard to come home, corner him in the kitchen, and tell him exactly what kind of uneducated, arrogant monster he was. I wanted to tell him that his pathetic penny pinching had just destroyed $500,000. But as my hand hovered over the railing of the stairs, my sommelier training kicked in. In a crisis, you do not act on emotion. You rely on objective data. I took a deep breath, forcing my heart rate to slow down. I looked at the dark, red puddle seeping under the door. The data was conclusive. The wine had been sitting in an 88-degree room for nearly 2 weeks. It was fully materized. The oxidation process was complete. There was absolutely nothing left to save. Even if I turned the compressor back on right now, it wouldn't uncook the wine. It wouldn't turn acetic acid back into ethanol. Then, a secondary, much more calculating thought entered my mind. If I confronted Richard today, if I screamed at him and told him he had ruined the collection, what would happen? He would panic. But Richard was also a manipulative coward. He would immediately call his homeowner's insurance company. He would lie. He would claim the HVAC compressor suffered a mechanical failure during the heat wave. He would file a massive insurance claim for the loss of a valuable asset. The insurance company would send an adjuster, verify the loss, and write Richard a check for $500,000. He would still get his money. He would still get his luxury boat. He would just get it from an insurance payout instead of an auction house. I couldn't let that happen. He didn't deserve to be bailed out by an insurance company. He deserved to face the absolute crushing consequences of his own arrogance. So, I made a choice. The hardest choice of my entire life. I decided to stay entirely silent. A week later, the heat wave finally broke. A cool front swept through the region, dropping the temperature back into the pleasant 70s. Richard, assuming the danger to his electric bill was over, went down to the basement and flipped the breaker back on. The cellar began to cool down again, locking the ruined vinegar in a perfectly preserved 55-degree tomb. He had no idea the damage was already permanently done. To celebrate his impending wealth, Richard decided to host a massive backyard barbecue. He invited a dozen of his middle management friends from work. He bought expensive steaks on his credit card, assuming he would pay it off when the auction check arrived. My mother practically begged me to attend, desperate to maintain the illusion of a happy, blended family. I agreed, knowing I needed to keep a close eye on the situation. The barbecue was a masterclass in toxic arrogance. Richard stood over the expensive gas grill, holding a spatula like a king holding a scepter, bragging loudly to anyone who would listen about the upcoming auction. $500,000, Richard boasted to a man named Gary, who was drinking a cheap beer on the patio. All sitting right underneath our feet. I've already signed the consignment paperwork. The auction house is sending specialized trucks next week to pick it all up. That's unbelievable, Rich, Gary said, looking genuinely impressed. $500,000? I wouldn't even know what to do with a bottle of wine that expensive. It's just grape juice in fancy glass, Richard scoffed, flipping a steak. But these rich snobs in the city will pay a fortune for it. Hey, you know what? I should bring a bottle up right now. Let's crack one open and toast to the new speedboat. My blood froze. If Richard went down to the cellar and opened a bottle right now, in front of his friends, he would immediately smell the vinegar. The trap would be sprung prematurely. He wouldn't take the collection to the auction house. He would cancel the transport trucks and immediately file the fraudulent insurance claim. I couldn't let him pull a cork. I had to stop him. I'll be right back, Richard announced, handing the spatula to my mother and walking toward the sliding glass door. I'm going to grab something dusty. I followed him into the house. He walked quickly down the basement stairs, pulled a key from his pocket, and unlocked the heavy oak door. He walked into the cool, dark cellar and grabbed a bottle completely at random from the nearest rack. When he walked back up the stairs, my heart sank. He was holding a bottle of 1989 Chateau Haut-Brion. It was a legendary first-growth Bordeaux, easily worth $2,000 at retail. And he was holding a cheap, plastic winged corkscrew in his other hand. I stepped in front of the sliding glass door, blocking his path to the patio. Move, Juliette, Richard said, glaring at me. I'm going to show Gary what a $2,000 bottle of wine tastes like. I didn't move. Instead of getting angry, I used the one weapon Richard couldn't defend against, his own profound insecurity in front of his friends. You can't serve that right now, Richard, I said, using a tone of voice usually reserved for speaking to small, uneducated children. Excuse me? He bristled. It's my wine. I'll do whatever I want. I know it's your wine, I replied smoothly, crossing my arms. But I'm trying to save you from embarrassing yourself in front of Gary and the other guys. Embarrassing myself? Richard repeated, his face flushing red. Yes, I said, leaning forward. That is a 1989 Haut Brion. It is over 35 years old. The cork is incredibly fragile. If you try to open it with that cheap plastic corkscrew, you are going to shred the cork into a million pieces and push it straight into the liquid. Furthermore, a vintage Bordeaux requires a minimum of 3 hours of careful decanting in a crystal carafe to separate the heavy sediment. If you just pop it open and pour it into red Solo cups with hot dogs, it's going to taste like bitter mud. Richard stared at me, his confidence wavering. If you walk out there right now and serve that wine incorrectly, I continued, pressing the psychological knife deeper, they aren't going to think you're a sophisticated millionaire. They are going to think you're a pretender who doesn't know how to handle wealth. You will look completely uneducated. Richard's jaw tightened. The absolute worst fear of a narcissist is being publicly exposed as a fraud. He looked at the bottle of Haut Brion. He looked at the cheap plastic corkscrew in his hand. He looked at Gary sitting on the patio through the glass door. He didn't want to look stupid. He didn't want his friends to judge him. You know what? Richard sneered, trying to save face. You're right. I'm not going to waste a $2,000 bottle on guys who drink Miller Lite anyway. It's a waste of money. Let the auction house deal with the decanting. He turned around, walked back down the basement stairs, and returned the Haut Brion to its rack. He locked the heavy oak door. He grabbed a 6-pack of cheap domestic beer from the refrigerator instead. Good call, I said quietly as he walked past me. I'm the one cashing the check, Juliette, he muttered bitterly. Don't ever try to tell me what to do in my own house. He walked back out to the patio, popped the tab on an aluminum can, and continued, bragging about his impending wealth. I stood in the kitchen, watching him through the glass. The trap was perfectly preserved. He had no idea that the bottle of 1989 Haut Brion he had just held in his hands wasn't a complex, sediment-heavy Bordeaux. It was just an expensive bottle of rotten vinegar. I let him turn the compressor back on. I let him spend the next 3 weeks corresponding with the luxury auction house in Manhattan. I let him sign the consignment contracts. I let him pay the exorbitant, non-refundable transport fees to have the massive collection carefully packed into specialized, climate-controlled trucks by professional movers, completely unaware that they were carefully transporting 2,000 bottles of spoiled vinegar. I let him build his entire dream around a massive, impending payday. And then I requested a day off from work, put on my best professional suit, and secured an invitation to the auction. I wanted a front-row seat to his execution. Have you ever discovered a massive, catastrophic mistake made by a toxic, arrogant person, and instead of warning them, you stepped back and let them walk completely blind into their own destruction? Did it require all of your patience to stay silent? Tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one. The silence in the auction house was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, pressurized quiet that only occurs when a room full of extremely wealthy people collectively witnesses a disaster. The lead appraiser stood at the polished mahogany podium, his face flushed with a mixture of shock and profound professional offense. He held the tasting glass of 1945 Chateau Mouton Rothschild at arm's length, as if it were a biohazard. The sharp, acrid stench of raw acetic acid was so powerful it completely overpowered the ambient smell of expensive perfume and tailored wool in the front rows. My stepfather, Richard, was standing just a few feet away from the podium. He hadn't realized what was happening yet, because he knew absolutely nothing about the delicate chemistry of vintage wine. He assumed the appraiser's reaction was some sort of theatrical, high society ritual. He stood there in his ill-fitting, rented tuxedo, maintaining his wide, greedy grin, practically bouncing on his heels as he waited for the bidding to start. The appraiser set the glass down forcefully on the podium. He didn't speak into the microphone. He turned directly to one of his white-gloved assistants, standing near the temperature-controlled display case. "Pull another one," the appraiser ordered, his voice clipped and furious. The 1982 Lafite. The assistant quickly retrieved a second bottle. He expertly sliced the foil and inserted the corkscrew. The moment he pulled the cork from the neck of the bottle, the assistant's face contorted. He didn't even need to pour it into a glass. The smell of spoiled, oxidized alcohol immediately hit the air. "Sir," the assistant whispered, handing the bottle to the appraiser, "it's fully maderized." The cork was completely dried out. The appraiser took the bottle, looked down the neck, and then slammed it down onto the podium next to the first glass. He turned to Richard. The professional, accommodating demeanor of the auction house completely evaporated, replaced by cold, unadulterated contempt. "Mr. Vance," the appraiser said, leaning toward the microphone so his voice echoed through the massive room, "what is the meaning of this?" Richard's grin finally faltered. He looked confused, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "What do you mean? It's the wine. It's the collection. Let's get the bidding started. I know what it's worth." "You clearly have no idea what it is worth," the appraiser fired back, his voice dripping with disdain. "'Cause what you have brought to my auction house is not a collection of first-growth Bordeaux. It is 2,000 bottles of spoiled, highly acidic salad dressing. This wine is dead, Mr. Vance. It has been severely, catastrophically cooked." A collective gasp, followed by a low murmur of shock, rippled through the audience. "Cooked?" Richard sputtered, his face turning a deep, angry shade of red. He stepped forward, waving his hands defensively. "What the hell are you talking about? That's $500,000 of wine. My wife's dead husband collected it for 30 years. It's been sitting in a basement the whole time. You don't know what you're talking about. You're trying to scam me." The appraiser's eyes narrowed. In the world of high-end auctions, calling an appraiser a scammer is the ultimate insult. "I am a certified wine and spirit education trust diploma holder, Mr. Vance," the appraiser stated, his voice turning to ice. "I have authenticated cellars for royalty. I know exactly what I am smelling. This collection has been subjected to extreme, prolonged heat exposure. The seals are broken. The ethanol has been entirely metabolized by bacteria. It is ruined, and the fact that you attempted to consign this garbage to my auction house is an insult to my profession and a waste of my client's time." "You're lying," Richard shouted, his voice cracking with panic. He grabbed the bottle of the 1982 Lafite off the podium, clutching it to his chest like a child. "You're just trying to drive the price down so you can buy it yourself." "It's fine. The wine is fine." That was my cue. I stepped out from the shadows of the back row. My heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor as I walked down the center aisle. The murmurs in the crowd died down as hundreds of heads turned to watch me. I was wearing a sharply tailored black professional suit. Pinned to my left lapel was a small, unmistakable gold badge. "He isn't lying, Richard," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the room. Richard froze. He stared at me, his eyes wide with shock. "Juliette, what are you doing here?" I didn't answer him. I walked straight up to the podium. I ignored my stepfather entirely and addressed the lead appraiser. "My name is Juliette," I said, offering him my hand. "Master Sommelier. The collection in question originally belonged to my late father. The appraiser looked at the gold pin on my lapel. The anger in his eyes instantly dissolved into profound, professional respect. He took my hand and shook it firmly. In our industry, the Master Sommelier title commands absolute authority. "It is an honor, Juliette," the appraiser said. "I am so incredibly sorry for the loss of this collection. It must have been magnificent." "It was," I replied softly. I picked up the tasting glass containing the ruined 1945 Mouton Rothschild. I held it up to the harsh gallery lights. I swirled the dark, cloudy liquid. I didn't need to smell it. The stench was radiating from the glass. But I performed the sensory evaluation anyway for the benefit of the room. I brought it to my nose and took a short inhalation. "Volatile acidity is off the charts," I diagnosed loudly, placing the glass back down. "Ethyl acetate and severe acetic acid. The physical structure of the wine has completely collapsed. Based on the rate of oxidation and the shrinkage of the corks I observed in the cellar weeks ago, this collection was exposed to ambient temperatures exceeding 85 degrees Fahrenheit for a minimum of 10 to 14 days. In a completely dry environment." I turned slowly to face Richard. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and was waiting for the click. The blood had completely drained from his face. He was sweating so heavily his rented tuxedo shirt was plastered to his chest. 85 degrees, I repeated, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register, which is exactly the temperature of the subterranean basement of my father's estate during the 2-week heat wave we had in July. Isn't that right, Richard? I don't know what you're talking about, Richard stammered, taking a step backward. He looked around the room, realizing that hundreds of incredibly wealthy, powerful people were staring at him with undisguised contempt. "Yes, you do," I said, stepping closer to him. I wasn't going to let him hide. I wanted every single person in that room to hear exactly what kind of man he was. "You saw the electric bill, didn't you? You saw that the dedicated commercial compressor for the wine cellar was pulling too much power fighting the heat wave. You calculated that it was costing you $20 a day. So, you went down to the electrical panel and you flipped the breaker." "No," Richard cried, shaking his head frantically. "I didn't. The machine broke. It was a mechanical failure." "It didn't break," I countered, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I know it didn't break because you turned it back on the moment. The heat wave broke to cool the basement down again. You thought you were so clever. You thought a basement was naturally cold enough. You thought you could save $300 on your electric bill and then sell my father's life work to buy yourself a speedboat." The crowd erupted in a mixture of gasps, low laughter, and profound disgust. In a room full of millionaires who spent fortunes preserving art and wine, the idea of a man destroying a $500,000 masterpiece to save $300 on an electric bill was not just tragic, it was pathetic. It was the ultimate display of low-class ignorance. You shut off the climate control to a $500,000 cellar. To save $300, the lead appraiser asked, looking at Richard as if he were an insect. "You are an absolute fool." "It's my wine," Richard screamed, his panic finally giving way to a desperate, cornered rage. "I can do whatever I want with it. You people are just snobs. It's just old grape juice. I'll take it somewhere else. I'll find a buyer who isn't a stuck-up elitist." "You won't find a buyer anywhere on earth, Richard," I said coldly, "because it's not wine anymore. It's vinegar. You could pour it on a salad, but I wouldn't recommend it. It's completely worthless." "We are done here, Mr. Vance," the appraiser announced, banging his wooden gavel sharply against the podium to regain control of the room. "The auction house officially rejects this lot. The items are fraudulent by nature of their chemical destruction. I am having my assistants remove the display cases from the floor immediately." "Wait, you can't just throw me out," Richard yelled, grabbing the edge of the podium. "I signed a contract. You have to sell it. The contract explicitly states that the consignor guarantees the items have been stored in a climate-controlled environment." The appraiser fired back. You breached the contract the moment you flipped that breaker. In fact, Mr. Vance, you owe us money. Richard blinked, his jaw dropping. What? Owe you money? For what? Non-refundable transport, cataloging, and insurance fees, the appraiser stated, pulling a clipboard from beneath the podium. You insisted we send 3 specialized, refrigerated, climate-controlled trucks to your estate in Connecticut to carefully transport this collection. You insisted we hire specialized handlers to pack it. The total cost was $15,000. According to your contract, because the lot was rejected due to your direct negligence, you are personally liable for the entirety of those logistical expenses. The appraiser handed the clipboard to Richard. I expect a cashier's check by the end of the week. Now, please remove yourself from my auction house before I have security escort you out. Richard stood there, holding the clipboard, staring at the itemized bill for $15,000. He had walked into the building expecting to become a half-millionaire. He had expected to buy a luxury boat. Instead, he was standing in front of New York's elite, publicly exposed as a cheap, ignorant thief, and handed a massive bill for carefully transporting 2,000 bottles of spoiled vinegar in refrigerated trucks. The wealthy patrons in the front row began to laugh. It wasn't a loud, raucous laughter. It was a quiet, refined, incredibly cruel chuckle that rippled through the room. They were laughing at his rented tuxedo. They were laughing at his stupidity. They were laughing at the absolute absurdity of a man who destroyed a fortune to save pennies. Richard looked at me. His face was a mask of pure hatred and humiliation. You knew, Richard hissed, his voice trembling. You knew the wine was ruined, and you didn't. Tell me, you let me pay for the trucks. You let me come here. Yes, I did, I whispered, stepping close enough so only he could hear me. Because if I had told you, you would have filed a fraudulent insurance claim and walked away with a check. You stole my father's legacy, Richard. Did you really think I was going to let you profit from it? I stepped back, allowing 2 large, suited security guards to approach the podium. Have a safe drive back to Connecticut, Richard, I said loudly. Try not to run the air conditioning in the car. You wouldn't want to waste the gas. The security guards flanked him, grabbing him by the arms of his rented tuxedo, and physically marched him up the center aisle and out the heavy brass doors of the auction house. Have you ever watched someone's absolute arrogance collide perfectly with their profound ignorance in a very public setting? Did you step in to save them? Or did you sit back and enjoy the show? Tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one. The fallout from Richard's catastrophic humiliation at the auction house did not end when the security guards pushed him out the brass doors. The true nightmare for him was just beginning, and it started with the physical logistics of 2,000 bottles of spoiled wine. Because the luxury auction house officially rejected the consignment lot due to fraud, they refused to hold the inventory in their Manhattan storage facility. They demanded that Richard immediately remove the property. But Richard, in his infinite cheapness, refused to pay the massive return shipping fees, to have the wine carefully transported back to Connecticut. The auction house didn't care. They hired a third-party, cut-rate hauling company, loaded the pallets of vinegar onto unrefrigerated box trucks, and sent them directly to my mother's estate. They added the heavy hauling fees to Richard's existing $15,000 debt. I wasn't there when the trucks arrived, but my mother told me exactly what happened. The haulers didn't carefully place the bottles back into the beautiful French oak racks. They were paid to drop the pallets and leave. They unloaded dozens of heavy cardboard boxes directly onto the floor of the subterranean cellar, stacking them haphazardly. Because the wine had been jostled and exposed to further heat during the cheap transport, dozens of bottles completely shattered. The basement flooded with the thick, pungent, inescapable stench of raw acetic acid. The smell was so incredibly powerful that it permeated the heavy oak door. It crept up the wooden stairs, seeped into the floorboards of the kitchen and filled the entire massive estate with the sour, nauseating scent of rotten vinegar. Richard returned to a house that literally reeked of his own failure. But the smell of the ruined wine accomplished something far more profound than just making the house uncomfortable. It broke the spell. For over a year, my mother, Eleanor, had operated in a state of submissive, conflict-avoidant denial. She had allowed Richard to bully her, control the finances, and dictate her life because she was terrified of being alone. She had even stood by silently while he stole her late husband's life work. But when Richard walked through the front door, his rented tuxedo rumpled and smelling of sweat, and the aggressive stench of vinegar burning her nostrils, the illusion completely shattered. Eleanor didn't see a strong, dominant man taking control of the family. She saw a pathetic, uneducated, profoundly arrogant fool. She saw a man who had taken a $500,000 masterpiece built by a brilliant architect and violently destroyed it simply to save $300 on an electric bill. For the first time since my father died, my mother found her spine. When Richard started screaming at her, blaming the auction house, blaming me, and throwing a massive temper tantrum about the $15,000 bill he had just been handed, Eleanor didn't cower. She didn't apologize. She didn't offer to make him dinner to calm him down. She walked into the kitchen, picked up a heavy cast iron skillet, and slammed it down onto the granite countertop with a deafening crash. "Shut up!" Eleanor screamed, her voice echoing through the vinegar-scented house. Richard stopped mid-rant, his mouth hanging open in shock. He had never heard her raise her voice before. "You are a stupid, arrogant, destructive little man," Eleanor said, her voice shaking with years of repressed anger. "My husband spent 30 years building that cellar. He loved it. He loved Juliette, and you destroyed it because you were too cheap to run an air conditioner. You made us a laughingstock. You ruined his legacy." "It was my wine," Richard yelled back, though he was visibly retreating. "I was trying to get us money. You were trying to buy a boat," she fired back. "Pack your bags, Richard. Get out of my house," Richard tried to argue. He tried to claim he had marital rights to the property. But Eleanor was done playing the victim. She immediately called her lawyer, the same aggressive estate attorney my father had used for years. Within 48 hours, she filed for a specialized, expedited divorce based on gross financial mismanagement and destruction of high-value marital assets. She secured a court order barring Richard from the primary residence while the divorce proceedings played out. Richard was completely ruined. He didn't just lose the $500,000 he thought he was going to make at the auction. He lost his access to my mother's comfortable lifestyle cell. And because of his absolute certainty that he was going to get a massive payout from the auction, Richard had made a fatal financial error weeks prior. He had taken out a high-interest, short-term personal bridge loan to put a non-refundable cash deposit down on the luxury 50-foot Sea Ray speedboat he had been drooling over. When the auction house handed his $15,000 debt over to aggressive corporate collection agencies, and the bridge loan came due, Richard couldn't pay either of them. He had to declare personal bankruptcy. He lost the deposit on the boat. His credit was completely annihilated. He was forced to move into a tiny, depressing one-bedroom apartment in a strip mall complex near his office. He went right back to drinking cheap, aluminum can beer, sitting alone in a hot apartment, staring at the walls, completely cut off from the wealth and status he had tried so desperately to steal. As for me, I didn't get the wine collection. I lost my father's beautiful cellar, but what I gained was far more valuable than a bottle of 1945 Mouton Rothschild. I gained my mother back. With Richard gone, Eleanor finally began to properly grieve my father. We spent hours sitting on the back patio of the estate, talking about him, remembering his kindness, his brilliance, and his passion for life. The dark, suffocating cloud that Richard had brought into our lives finally lifted. Eventually, the massive estate became too much for Eleanor to maintain alone. The smell of the ruined wine had seeped so deeply into the concrete of the basement that it required a specialized hazmat remediation crew to completely gut the cellar and seal the foundation just to make the house sellable. When the house finally sold, Eleanor did something that completely surprised me. She transferred a massive portion of the real estate proceeds, roughly $500,000, directly into an ironclad trust fund in my name. "I couldn't protect your father's collection," Eleanor told me, tears in her eyes as she handed me the paperwork. "I let that monster destroy your inheritance because I was too weak to stop him. This is my apology, Juliette. I want you to use this money to build your own legacy, buy your own cellar, build something beautiful." I used a portion of that money to open my own boutique wine consulting and private appraisal firm in the city. I cater exclusively to high net worth clients, managing their massive, multi-million-dollar cellars, ensuring that their environmental controls are flawless, and protecting their investments from ignorance and heat. I am incredibly successful. I am respected in my field, and I never have to speak to Richard again. But I know that my story is controversial within the sommelier community. When I tell colleagues what happened, that I walked down into that basement, saw the temperature at 88 degrees, and chose to say absolutely nothing, some of them are horrified. They view the destruction of a 1982 Lafite or a 1945 Mouton Rothschild as a crime against history. They argue that as a master sommelier, I had a professional, ethical obligation to try and save the wine. They say I should have turned the compressor back on immediately, called Richard, and fought to preserve whatever was left, rather than letting the maderization process complete itself just to set a trap. They believe that sacrificing a $500,000 masterpiece of viticulture just to ensure the public humiliation and financial ruin of my stepfather was petty, vindictive, and entirely disproportionate. But there is a hard truth about dealing with toxic, arrogant people who steal things they do not understand. If I had saved the wine, Richard would have still sold it. He would have profited from his theft, bought his boat, and continued to terrorize my mother with his unchecked power. The only way to stop a narcissist is to let their own ignorance completely destroy them on a public stage where they cannot blame anyone but themselves. I didn't destroy the wine. The heat destroyed the wine. I just let physics and chemistry do their job. So I will ask you this. If an arrogant, petty family member stole your most prized inheritance, and you discovered they were ignorantly destroying it, would you have stepped in to save the priceless artifact, knowing they would still profit from it? Or would you have stayed perfectly silent, sacrificed the inheritance, and watched them confidently walk into total financial and public ruin? Tell me honestly in the comments. I read every single one.